Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you for the community who are listening in. I'll go through this full presentation, regardless of how big our size of our audience is, and I really appreciate the people who did come out tonight. But mostly tonight, this would be as a recorded public hearing, and so we want to make sure that those who chose to stay remote and stay home get the same presentation as those who came in tonight. So just in terms of what this meeting is, this is a public hearing on the proposed 21-22 school budget. It's specifically about the budget. I can answer any questions that you have regarding the budget. What are we doing? Thanks, Alex. So I thought I was up and going. Again, this is about the proposed budget for next school year, and we do have a live mic in the audience. As pointed out, it's up here by the podium to my right. And if you have a question this evening, just go to the microphone so it gets recorded for the community. And thank you for, again, being here. So the very first thing I want to talk about in relation to not just this budget, but next year's budget, of course, is the new middle school. The middle school right now is about a third complete, believe it or not. It's already that far along. All the steel has been erected outside. A lot of the steel has been erected inside. Almost all the concrete has been poured, interior framing. The roof has been insulated, and we still have our goal of occupying the building in March of 22. The contractor has been amazing. The architecture design has worked flawlessly. It's really been a great project. We put the bond out last July. We had an interest rate of 1.97%. That was incredible to get below 2%. The first presentation that Sue Caswell, my business manager, and I did at Moheramet related to financing, we thought it could be as high as 5.5% at that point because we based it off the high school bond. And so it was, the economy really favored us, and we were able to bring that bond in at a really attractive rate, which will play into the 21-22 budget. So if you have driven up Co Drive, this neon green, now turning blue building is pretty obvious. It really has a presence on Co Drive. If you're driving from the high school to the middle school, it feels like it's much bigger than a 4-story building. If you're driving from the current middle school toward it, it feels like a 4-story building. Just has the way it sits on the property, there's a retaining wall that from my office going toward it that really makes it look like it's a very tall building. This is where we stand in the music hall. So all of the concrete has been poured. This picture is a little dated. I visited on Tuesday, and the concrete has all been poured for the seating and for the floor. So it's really taking shape. It's going to be an amazing music performance space for our students. This is looking from the music hall toward the gym, and just giving you a sense of expanse of flooring and concrete. This is the learning commons we talked about. So if you walk into the front door, you have this very, very wide, long, what you would perceive as a hallway, but it actually is going to be the eating area for students, and it's also going to be an extension of the library when the kids aren't eating. So it's going to be a pretty phenomenal space. So the middle school is coming along extremely well. We couldn't be asking more of the contractor. The weather has been cooperating, and so there's no reason to believe that we won't be having our kids occupy that building next winter. As far as this budget hearing goes, it's always good to talk about what's going on that's going well in the district. So I'm going to spend some time talking about where we are as a district, talking about enrollment, because that's always a hot button issue in the 3 towns, and talk a little bit about our financials and the warrants. So, no surprise, as as we go through this budget year and into next year, COVID is still going to be a factor. You know, the interesting thing is last March when we voted on the budget, the school budget passed with 84% support from the community, and the new middle school passed with 76% support of the community. And we all felt thrilled. A week later, Governor Sununu closed schools across the state of New Hampshire, and we entered into this very protracted time period where COVID has been a factor in how we've operated. As we have worked through this time period with only 3 days worth of preparation, most schools, I would say, dare say all schools in the March through June timeframe really struggled to even have kind of a centralized expectation of what we could accomplish because nobody had done it before. We did several surveys of our parents and of our students and asked them what they needed for the fall. And almost uniformly, the issue that came through is can we still have a standardized schedule with expectations of students signing up for their classes and having a regular school day? And we did do that. And so we opened up the school with very clear expectations of ourselves and our staff, and we moved forward. COVID still plays a factor in this budget. And when we talk about this budget a little bit, one of the, well, there's a couple of places in the budget where COVID plays a factor. One is in our capital improvement line. We have about $300,000 that we would normally use to continue to improve our facilities. The fact is that that may be used for that, or it may be used to continue to compensate us in terms of how we need to spend our money related to COVID. So that $300,000 will either be spent on COVID-related issues, or it'll be spent on maintaining our school infrastructure. When we start talking about where we are academically, about a month ago, we did not have this data, but it came in just about 2 weeks ago. Our SAT scores in the district, despite the COVID impact, have still remained very competitive with where we have been in the past. The place that we were impacted was the percentage of participation. Normally that would be over 90%, just over 90%, and it's set at about 85%. And that would be because parents chose, or students chose, not to come to school to take it because they were concerned about COVID. Our math scores, we have 67% proficient across the district compared to a 43% state average. That is in line with past results. And obviously, based on this, we continue to be one of the highest performing school systems in the state. Our college placement rate for the spring was 82%, 75% of the kids entering a 4-year college, and 7% entering a 3 to a 1-year program. And this is an unusual number for us. Normally, our military or work number would be less than 10%, and this particular year it was much higher at 17%. So that was interesting. And our gap number, which for this particular graduating class was 1%, typically is 2 or 3%. So there were some variables that occurred in terms of our results. High school graduation rate, which is something that Oyster River has been very, very proud of, again, is at 100%, meaning every single senior graduated last spring. And talked about the middle school. And we have a very active anti-racism committee that was motivated by the district 5 years ago, but I would say brought back with enthusiasm this fall as parents in the community asked us to participate in that work, and that's been great. I often say that one of the highlights of our district, besides the 100% placement rate is the services we do for our neediest kids. So our neediest kids, meaning our special education population, children with identified disabilities. So when I say 100% of our kids graduate from high school, that includes all of our special needs population kids who are ready to graduate. So you compare that 100% to approximately 67% that occurs across the country. 0% of our students with disabilities drop out. I guess I gotta keep my place here. And 43% of our special needs population participate in a four-year college program. 9.2% this particular year on the two-year program, and 4.6% in that 1, 2, or 3-year program or GAP program or technical program. And 1/3 of our special needs population graduate and enter the workforce. And again, a much higher than average normal number for the military at 9.2%. So all of those highlights are pretty consistent with how we worked pre-COVID. District current enrollment, people are always asking me what's the enrollment numbers. So this is by school. So the Massway School is at 326 students, the Moheramet School at 288 students, the middle school at 658, and the high school at 839. So that would be as of the October 1st enrollment. Those numbers could be higher or lower today, but we use October 1st because that is the state mandated deadline for reporting enrollment. So anytime you see enrollment numbers from me, they always go back to that point in time. When we start talking about projected enrollment, which is also of interest to the towns, what we see is our current enrollment of 2,128 students. And then, as you can see, it varies within 100 students over the next 4 years. I would add that we have based our projections this year on NESDEC because our long-range planning committee was not available to us. I'm glad to say that the long-range planning committee has reactivated and they will be working on specific enrollment projections related to the district. And those numbers are far more accurate because they start customizing the needs as we look at live births, as we look at cohort survival, meaning how many kids go from one grade to the next grade. The long-range planning committee is made up of community members who work diligently to try to fine-tune those numbers so they're useful to the school board. When we look at enrollment by town, you can see that there really isn't a pattern. You're seeing, numbers fluctuate in all three towns. If the numbers go up in a town, that's good for that town. If the numbers go down in a town, that's not good. And the reason that is those numbers are associated with state subsidy. And so it does impact each town on how the enrollment is reported. So enrollment has been pretty consistent. I remember the first year I came in, the projections were that by the time we reached, this year, the enrollment would be well under 2,000, and it's never been under 2,000 since I've been here. So it's really the attractiveness of the district that has maintained the numbers above 2,000. When we get to the budget goal, I just want to give a shout out to the Finance Committee. Al chaired the Finance Committee, and Michael and Brian, who's not here tonight, couldn't be here tonight, worked with me on this particular budget and Sue really since last May. And if you think about it, the budget passed, the current budget passed in March, and we started the budget parade of months of work in May. Normally, one, there hasn't been a finance committee, and two, it wouldn't reach the board until someplace in October, late October. So it really speaks to the finance committee's diligence in working with Sue and I, not just for 2 months, but really for the 7 months it took to get to this place. What they did and why we formed it really is about the middle school. Initially, we were petrified that the middle school would have such a dramatic impact on taxes that we felt it was important to start early to see if we could create efficiencies in the proposed budget so we didn't really cripple the towns in terms of taxes. And the school board authorized the finance committee to work with me and Sue, and basically they recommended this budget goal, which is that the budget could grow as high as 3.5%, or as low as 2.5%, with the middle number, of course, being 3. They put some conditions on it, which would mean that it had to include all the negotiated warrant articles. So in this particular budget, you'll see a warrant article for the bus drivers and for our para-educators. And, you know, the reality is that through all of this work, they managed to have a budget that, expenditure side, that grew only 2.39%. It actually could have been lower than that, except the state decided to shift some more retirement costs to the local system. But when we got the revenue numbers, it boosted that 2.39% to 3%. And what that means is that the state has lessened its support, not just of Oyster River, because I certainly don't want this to be an Oyster River story, but they've lessened their support for public education across the state. And you'll see when I get to the impact of this budget, even though it's a 3% growth, that it has a pretty dramatic impact on our smaller towns. It has even a bigger impact, or the loss of state revenue has an even bigger impact on towns that are far less affluent than ours. So that gets us to, you know, the process. The very first budget that I put together was approximately 4.65%. And this just gives you the sense of how we worked through the budget to bring it down as far as we did. So one of the tools that the school board used that was incredibly effective was a retirement incentive. So we put out an offer to teachers across the district that if you are age eligible to retire and you wish to retire, then the board put forward an incentive to encourage that. That was a major tool at the board's disposal. They saved they saved over $600,000. It's not an exact number because we won't know exactly how much we saved. We could have saved more than that until we start hiring the replacements for those teachers. But my estimate is at least 600, if not more. That was huge. That helped push the budget down as we were building it. I mentioned the bond rate that we got on the new middle school was phenomenally low. That worked to our advantage. And then, of course, the state shifting retirement costs to the district worked to our disadvantage. And then, of course, the loss of state revenue for public education worked to our disadvantage. So it was sort of a roller coaster ride from May to the point that the board adopted this draft budget. But sometimes, you know, it's like everything else. Sometimes it works to your advantage and sometimes it doesn't. So that kind of gives you the history of how we got here. No surprises in terms of the major drivers. Health insurance for the system went up 6.5%. Believe it or not, that's good news because we thought it might go up as much as 10%. So that worked to our advantage. So that increased the budget by $382,000. The Guild agreement, in the second of 5 years, the union for the teachers, we had estimated that going up $771,534. And that obviously is offset by the retirement incentive. Then the New Hampshire retirement system generously shifted more expense onto the local school systems across the state. For us, that was a $676,000 increase, over which we had no control. And in terms of our capital plans, I didn't talk much about it in this particular presentation, but the board has adopted capital plans for transportation/buses, for the facilities, meaning everything from roofs to windows to lights to flooring to, and the like, and a capital plan for technology. So we kept the technology one flat, but we're in the last year of a 10-year replacement cycle on our buses. So why is that important? We'll go back to the first year again that Sue and I worked together. We had buses that were dropping transmissions literally in the road. We had buses that were failing with brakes because for the decade before Sue and I worked together, there was no replacement cycle for the buses. So we anticipate a bus lasts about 10 years. So at $45,000, this allows us to get 2 new leased buses, which we feel is critically important for the safety of our children. So often, this is another question I'm asked a lot, how much has the budget increased? And so I kind of give this a historical perspective. There are years that in my tenure, the highest year was 4.41%. But you can see that we try really hard to stay around the 3% level. And the variables that always are hard to predict are health insurance and what the state's going to do. In this particular year, in the second year Sue and I worked together, we asked the board to create an emergency fund. And boy, did we need it this year. So over the years, from unexpended balances, we had been able to put money away into an emergency fund. And as we put the final dressing on this proposed budget, we asked the board to release $500,000 to offset taxes on this budget, and you'll see why when I start talking about the impact of this budget. So just keep in mind that this budget is in total a 3% increase, but the impact by towns is going to be dramatically different. So the board tapped into its emergency funds in order to make sure that this budget didn't become prohibitive. Overall, going by the board's budget goal, you're looking at a general fund of $48,707,995. The bus driver contract increases $18,070. The para contract increases by $63,853 for an overall budget of $48,789,919. So that gets us to this very detailed slide. I don't read it. What it does is it shows you where the money is being expended in the district. And you can see that it makes sense when you look at the size of a school, how much it increases. And the high school, of course, would be always the larger of our operations. The reason the numbers are so small at both the elementary schools is because of the retirement incentive. Normally those numbers would be more proportionate, but they're smaller this year because the elementary staff was able to capitalize on the retirement incentive. The other number that I point out is the commitment the district has to special education. This district really does a great job in putting the right people in the right place to help our children, and that shows in our budget. The number that really stands out, and I made it in green so that people could see it, it will look like the SAU budget went up $507,000. Almost all of that is the bond on the middle school. It just happens to it occupies that line. So when you see a number like that, normally you'll see the SAU budget go up pretty nominally compared to all the other operations. But in this particular year, it looks pretty big. And that's only because of the bond on the middle school. So that gets you the cost centers, that also gives you the overall cost, it gives you the warrant articles, and that's how we get to the 3% overall budget increase. So this next slide is the killer, all right? And the reason I say that is I want to go back to what I was saying earlier about the impact of loss of state revenue. This slide is what happens when the state doesn't provide the funding that it provided the year before. So when you look at Durham, you say, well, that's not much of an impact, it's 34 cents. Well, that's because in the current budget, Durham got almost no new state money. But when we look at Lee and Madbury, they had a significant amount of state money in this budget that the state has taken away in the next budget. So it's not about the 3% increase, it's about the loss of state revenue. So when we look at the impact of a 3% increase on our budget on the town of Lee, it's $2.07 per thousand. We look at the impact at Madbury, it's $1.47 per thousand. Those are unusually high numbers of impact. I would share with you that I have a friend who's a superintendent in the North Country, and her budget went up $33,000, and her tax impact went up over $6 because the poorer the school system, the greater they rely on state subsidy. And so, everything is relative. I am hopeful. We can't put this into a budget because this number would not be real. But I am hopeful that the Republican Senate and House and Governor will react to the impact on rural New Hampshire that are so dependent on state subsidy to run their school systems and put more money into the state support for public education. If that happens, these numbers will go down dramatically, depending on how much they put in. But even half as much as they put in this year into next year would make a huge difference for Lee and Madbury. And this gets to the issue that I'm always asked. So Sue is like super conservative, and she always wants me to talk about worst case scenarios. And so this is where this comes in. So this is a history of what we projected the tax effort to be, and then what the actual tax effort was. So when we hit the end of September, Sue will put together the actual tax impact for the three towns. And we projected, as an example, an increase in tax effort for Madbury and Lee this year. They both came back with a zero impact. In fact, Lee's was less than zero because of that state funding I talked about. And Durham's went down dramatically, but they were still in the positive. Al, can you remember, was it like 17 cents or 13 cents or something? Yeah, so it went down dramatically. So I always caution the select boards and the council when I'm doing these presentations to remember that we're still 10 months out from actually knowing what the impact is on taxes. The other piece that's not here is, the increase in valuation of the towns. So those two issues come about around mid-September to end of September. Sue then can calculate the actual impact of the school budget on the towns. But if you look through the history, other than the estimated one, these are the real ones. So our estimate and our real. So you can see that in Durham, you can see that in Lee, and you can see that in Madbury. So we have a pretty good history of either being right on or over. And so I share that so that people don't want to tar and feather me when they see those numbers, because they're pretty extraordinary. When we talk about the default budget, so this is what would happen if our budget failed. Our budget would actually be, we would get $92,795 less if the budget were to fail in March. So I will share that with you. And then in terms of the warrant articles, Warrant articles are always, and this is always painful, written in legalese because they have to meet legal requirements. So essentially, we would never talk this way. We would talk the way I've been talking. This is the impact of the budget, and this is, how much it's going up. But Article 3 is the catch-all article that grabs the local and it grabs the special accounts. And so in the end, this article reflects what I was talking about in terms of the proposed budget. Article 4 is about the bus drivers and approving their contract. Article 5 is about the paras and their contract. And then we do have a unique article this year, and for all the years to propose it, I think this is the best one because we just used it. We just used $500,000 of this emergency set-aside that the board had for years like this. So the state has allowed the unassigned general funds from the preceding fiscal year to be set aside from 2.5% to 5%. And this is where the board was able to tap into the money that they set aside for a year like this. So I would strongly hope and encourage the community to support this particular warrant article, because if we had not had that $500,000 to use, the impact on the 3 towns would have been even higher. It would have been higher for Lee and Medbury and Durham, but much higher for Lee and Medbury had the board not had that fund that was approved by the voters to use. And then in terms of Article 7, this is really just a set-aside so that a future board can purchase the solar array that's going to be installed in the middle school, in the new middle school, in 7 years. So essentially, the money set aside would be that future board, that future superintendent, that future business manager would be able to say, okay, here's the money that the school system has been putting aside for 7 years so that we can buy out the solar array. And the advantage to being able to do that is that the system, the school system, if we do that in 7 years, will save over $2 million in operating costs for the new middle school. So that's something that I certainly would highly encourage the voters to put forward and pass. And then just in terms of dates, we're here tonight. Again, I appreciate my audience. And then the next major meeting is our deliberative session. That's February 2nd. If I can just speak to a moment on our deliberative session. So typically, we've seen up to 100 people come to deliberative session. Last year was the 100 people because it was the bond on the middle school, and that really drove attendance. Typically, it might be, maybe around half that, around 50. So this room can hold 50 people, even with social distancing, so it works. But if we had 100 people, then we need to have an auxiliary space. And so what we're planning is that there's probably 70 seats available in this room for the public, and then we would use the gymnasium, put a video and a microphone in the gymnasium so that no one's going to be turned away from deliberative session. And then under state rules, we have to have a room set aside for those who do not want to wear a mask. So we'll use the music room behind the stage for that, and they'll have their own entrance. We'll also have video and a microphone there. So the difference between deliberative session and tonight is deliberative session is a meeting of the legislative body, which is not the school board. It's the people. And so deliberative session requires that everyone have access to the presentation, and so that's why we're using the gym and the music room to support deliberative session. So that will be set up that way. It should be safe. We'll use social distancing and masks in this room and in the gymnasium. And if anybody wants to attend without a mask, we have a room set aside for them. And then, of course, the final stage in the budget process is the voting. And in Durham, it will be here at the high school from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. In Lee, it'll be at the safety complex from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And at Madbury, it'll be at the town hall from 11 to 7 p.m. So, any questions that you have regarding the 21-22 school budget? Glad to answer. Because of the purpose of this meeting, that's all I can answer about budget stuff. So I'd be glad to do that. No? Questions? Yeah, if you just go, if you won't. What slide number? I'll go there.
Slide number 16.
All righty, thank you.
Hi there. So Michelle Dunbar from Madbury. I have just a question about the major drivers there on your slide 16. Thank you for sort of putting this in general terms, just to ask questions. You said on a couple of these points you have no wiggle room, and I guess would that be, which ones would those be?
Sure.
The non-wiggle room ones.
So the health insurance is set outside this.
insurance.
When I say wiggle room, it's things that we don't control
Well,
versus.
right, that's what, yeah, uh-huh.
And the retirement system shift is outside of our control.
Okay,
The bus lease is in our control.
yeah,
The guild agreement was already approved by the voters 2 years ago, so, yeah. So we don't have any control over that.
so that never gets revisited, the guild agreement?
No, once it's approved, whatever the duration of the contract is, it's set until the next contract. And then, yeah, I think I got them all.
Okay, so
anything else?
explain to me again the increase offset of offering a retirement incentive. That's what happened this past year?
No, for this next year. That's how we were able to bring the budget down to the
I gotcha.
2.39%.
Okay. So that's a positive number? Am I understanding that?
That is a positive number.
Okay. And then remind me again about capital account adjusted to meet budget goal. What is?
So that was, I was talking about the impact of, if we had to use money next year for COVID, we would not spend it in the maintenance capital account.
Okay.
We would shift that to COVID-related expenses. But I'm very hopeful, Michelle. I'm hoping beyond hope that we can open normally in the fall.
Yeah, so, and that's the Article 5 you talked about. Is that correct? Is that to keep more money? If we want voters to vote for is that the Article 5 or is the Article 6? That's the emergency fund, the Article 6?
Let me get there, Michelle.
I'm sorry, slide 27.
That's okay. Just takes me a minute.
I just
want to make sure I'm answering your question.
Yeah, I just want to connect the dots so I understand what we're going to be voting for.
Yes, Article 6 is giving the board the authority to set aside unexpended balances, not raise money, but anything left over. They can put up to 5% ceiling. Now, in any given year, Michelle, the board has put some money there, but it's never, gone to the limit of putting every available end-of-the-year balance there, because we also have obligation to send $400,000 back to the towns in terms of tax relief, so that's part of the budget.
Okay.
And so it's that difference between the $400,000 and the end of the year. So the board would put money here, they put it in that $125,000 account for the solar array. So if that passes, that's a have to. So if the board has any money beyond the 400,000, that 125,000 now has to go into that account because the people have approved it.
Okay, so
And-
now you're talking about Article 7, the
Yep.
solar arrays.
Yep.
And so that's related to Article 6. It's like those two monies can be grouped together in case of an emergency need?
No.
Okay.
Article 7
Okay.
is what we call a dedicated account.
Dedicated for that particular reason?
Exactly. So there's no
Okay.
flexibility by the board. Once the people say, this is what we want you to do,
Yeah.
the board has to do it.
I gotcha, okay.
Whereas Article 6, it provides a ceiling, and the board has discretion as to how much money it can put there based on the end-of-the-year balances.
Okay, gotcha.
I would think of Article 6, when we first talked about this, we kind of thought about it as an insurance policy against
Right.
future unknowns.
Right.
Sort
and
of
that-
like we would do in our homes, we try to set aside
Sure.
an emergency account.
And that sort of impacted our taxes because it was there, and now Madbury, Lee, and Durham do not get taxed extra because we've incurred higher costs.
That's right. Madbury and Lee and Durham all would have seen the impact of this budget be much higher
Gotcha,
if the board said, no, we're not using that emergency fund.
gotcha.
But we all recognized that this was the year to use it.
Sure, and how often do we actually use that particular fund? How
I think
often?
we've only used it once before in my tenure. It's been 9 years, Sue, that we used it one time. But we've never used it to this degree, Michelle.
Okay.
This is a major, this
Yeah.
draws it down by about half, a little over half. We used a lot of that emergency money because we were concerned about our two smaller town partners.
Right, I appreciate that. I'm from Madbury.
Me too.
So the other question is, and so you discussed something about a default budget.
Yep.
And tell me, if we have to go to this default budget, how does that impact your slide number 16 when you talk about your major drivers? How
But
will
what
that,
it-
I just don't understand
sure.
this talk.
So if the voters say no to the budget proposal,
Yeah.
then I would sit with the finance committee,
Yeah.
and we would identify where in the budget we would find $92,000. We would come back to the full board, explain the process to them, and if they agree with the identified areas, we would reduce our budget expenditures by $92,000.
Okay, so if I look here, $92,000, it can't, I mean, that would wipe out the whole transportation fund. So then where else would it come from? If it can't come out of insurance, it can't come out of retirement.
Sure,
And
it almost-
I guess the guild money is already
Yeah.
set aside, so then where does the money come? Like,
Well,
how
you're-
does it get
you-
reduced? That's my point.
It's a great question, Michelle.
I'm just a very general,
Absolutely.
I need to think in big terms.
I would
so-
tell you, and Al's going to cringe when I say this, but the place where we have a little bit of discretion is in the capital account in terms of what projects we choose to spend our money on. So if we have to chase after 92,000,
Okay.
it probably will be a combination of a little here and a little there.
gotcha.
And then if we need a bigger number, we usually turn to the capital account and say, okay, we're not going to put that ventilator in, or we're not going to do
Right, okay.
that roof.
Right, so like when I was just generally looking at the budget, the little line items, like supplies for this and supplies for that, and that's so you kind of go into those little line items and Ts
Yeah.
and,
So when we do that exercise, Michelle, and I've had to do it a number of times in my career, what we really try to do is protect the classroom and try to find areas where we can, chip away. It might be $5,000 from the legal account, or it might be, $20,000 for a new air handler, or it might be, but we try to stay away from things that would support children in the classroom. And $92,000 would be an effort, but, if that's what the voters wanted us to do, then we
Right.
would do it, because we have
Gotcha.
no choice.
right, and this may sound like a silly question, but because we haven't really been in person, are we saving money on things like ink and paper and teacher workshops and,
Hmm. Yep.
you know what I mean, PTO things and,
We are
all
do-
of those
yeah,
little tiny
no,
things?
That's a great question, Michelle, as well. We are saving money in some areas.
Yeah.
And we're spending through the nose in other
Right,
areas.
with technology. Yeah.
Not even that. We're actually in that conversation with the finance committee Committee. We were going to talk about it last night, but we ran out of time, so we'll have it in the next meeting. But the issue is COVID, it's kind of the COVID impact on schools and municipalities across the country. I was going to say state, but really it's across the country. And so you anticipate spending X amount of money in various accounts, and then, COVID lands and you have expenses, so remember this budget that we're in passed the week before we put into remote by the governor.
Right.
We had no money in this budget to think about
sanitization,
PPE, masks,
yeah.
anything.
Right. Sure,
and so
any of those, right.
Immediately, what I recommended to the full board is that we not freeze the budget, but allow me the discretion to not spend money that we would normally spend in, say, in the summertime,
right.
Not replace positions immediately, but look at what our needs are. And so the reason that I felt it was critical to do that was I knew that someplace in this budget that we're in, that it was going to be a crippling effect. I thought my projection was it was going to be in transportation. However, it didn't turn out to be transportation, it turned out to be food service. So right now, we're projecting a loss in food service of between $250,000 and $350,000.
Okay.
So then you get into that whole thing of how do you adjust your budget accordingly? But because
right.
The board was supportive of my being very, very conservative in the first half of this year, we were able to, Sue and I are confident that we can compensate for that loss. Then we had about $150,000 that we set aside for PPE, which we thought we would have to take from the capital account. As it turns out, late in the year, we got $39,000 initially from the state and about $400,000 in the second round. And so that helped compensate for the PPE and hopefully part of the loss in food service. But now we're into the second half of the year, and what we do is we assess the health of the budget. We assess it monthly, but in terms of being able to start to get a picture of the end of the budget year,
right.
We pay attention to that 50% mark. And as we're moving toward these new models at the middle school and high school, we also really feel compelled to put extra human resources in these buildings to compensate and help get us through the winter and spring. So it's really a story of matching your assets to your expenditures and making the adjustments that you have to make in order to end the school year solvent, be able to carry that $400,000 from this budget out to the towns that we committed to. And so we've been, the only word I can use is frugal, so frugal, unusually frugal, just because I predicted when we started this budget on July 1st that we would have expenses that we could not have anticipated because we didn't know we were going to be in COVID times. And thanks to Sue's sharp pencil and our board support, we've been able to get to this halfway point in a good place.
Thank you. I guess I'm just overly concerned. I know this is a very modest increase in budget, I imagine. But, I think, projected going out 1-2 years, I mean, we could basically have an economic recession, and I would just want to be very conservative about increasing the budget at all. If not, can we reduce it? I mean, can we just go bare bones, to get us through the next 2 years?
Well,
our tax, the tax burden. There's a lot on our communities.
I hear you, and I've heard versions of this question for my 3 decades as a superintendent. So when people say they want a zero increase budget, 80% of the budget is teachers and support staff, the 415 employees the district has to service the kids, whether it's bus drivers, cooks, teachers, and so forth.
Right.
So what it would require is layoffs in order to get to zero, because so much of the budget is personnel. And then
Yeah.
another part of the budget that's fixed is generally your utility costs, your insurance
Right.
costs, and those kinds
Well,
of
yeah,
things.
and those always go
So when
up.
you get down to it in terms of discretion, you're looking at school supplies, and you're looking at books, and you're looking at materials that support custodians in terms of cleaning. So it's a very small percentage of the budget that actually you can grab onto unless you lay off people. And when you get to lay off people, and at least in this community, I haven't seen a lot of will to do that, which is why we use the retirement incentive. I would tell you that had the state not cut the budget, cut their funding, and had they not shifted the retirement cost onto the community, we actually would have brought in a budget that was really close to zero.
Yeah. I don't
That's how
expect a
frugal this budget
zero
really
budget,
was.
but yeah, I don't expect a zero budget, but I'm just wondering, can we utilize these incentive retirement strategies again for this year, if not incentive early retirement incentives?
Well,
I mean,
remember-
has that even been done?
Yeah, these incentives are for the next budget.
Okay, so I think,
Yeah.
okay, gotcha. All right. So I'm just trying to think creatively.
We do that all the time, so appreciate any thoughts that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that we need to grow a little bit in the budget, but I just, I'm just concerned about the overall wellness of our community, so.
Yeah, when we first started this, Michelle, we thought the budget, when we looked at this last May, it was easy to see a 6.5% increase in the budget because of all of the other costs that we thought were coming that were offset. So, I think the board, the finance committee, and the full board have done a really good job of containing growth, because this budget could have been twice as big. And, they just really went through it line by line, took advantage of every opportunity, used the retirement incentive. So I think they did a really great job coming to this point in this time. Beyond this point in this time, we'd have to really start looking at personnel, and then you see class sizes go up and people start getting, this room would be full.
All right, well, thank you.
You're more than
Appreciate it.
welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you for all your questions. I bet you asked a lot of questions that a lot of people who aren't here would have asked, so it was great. Jill?
How many teachers last year took advantage of the retirement bonus?
About they take advantage this year for next year. It was about 17. Could have been 16. I think it was 17 in the end.
17, I'm just confused. So 17 teachers at the end of last school year said
No,
that they weren't going to
at the
teach
end of
year?
this school year,
Oh, so we
they
already
retire,
know?
and we start the savings in this proposed budget next
Whoa,
year.
so 17 teachers that are teaching now are not going to come back next year?
Correct.
Are we concerned about the long-term impact of that? Because that makes me.
I love this question. It's a great question. Denise,
Like, I like new teachers, and I think they're full of vigor, but I really like the seasoned ones, so it makes me just a little nervous.
Sure, and we have this conversation at the full board level as well, Jill, and really what it boils down to is, if you think about a bell curve, we lean toward the more expensive end of the bell curve. We have a lot of teachers in the senior area, and when Denise always raises it, anytime I bring up this issue, I'm really concerned about losing that talent. But we have, I think it's 215 teachers, so we're losing 17 of 215. They are amazing people we're losing, don't get me wrong. I mean, they will be a loss. But we also are making space for newer staff to grow within the district as well. So it's not such a big number that it isn't something that we can compensate for, but it's just perfect in terms of taking care of that retirement system shift from state to local.
How many teachers retire on average prior to this year?
Well, I would say about 3 a year.
So 3, and now we're at 17?
Yeah.
That's a little scary.
I hear you.
We have my daughter is a new teacher, and he's great, so I appreciate new teachers and they come in with new ideas, but it just feel like everyone that lives here for the school, and it makes me nervous.
Well, let me also share, Jill, and maybe this will lower your anxiety a little bit. It's very, very rare that we hire a newbie right out of college. What we budget for is somebody with about 6 or 7 years' experience, and we budget for somebody who's like at a master's level. That gives the principals lots of flexibility in terms of choice. Just means that they can't hire at the top of the scale unless the person we're looking at is someone who is in one of those rare areas. You know, if we were hiring a physics teacher, if we were hiring a school counselor, a speech therapist, those all tend to be expensive because of how rare they are in the state, and basically what happens is generally you're attracting somebody from another school system to you who has experience. When we start talking about primary teachers, when we start talking about middle school or high school teachers outside of specialty areas, we get a lot of really great applications, and so I'm not as anxious or nervous as you and Denise, because I go through this every time with Denise, and she always cautioned me about this very issue. And so far, we've hired tremendous people coming into the district. So I'm sorry for the loss, but I'm also positive about the opportunity that it presents for the district.
Thank you.
Yep. So that would bring us to the conclusion of this public hearing. I thank you both for coming out, and all the people at home who tuned in. And I hope that we'll see you at deliberative session on February 2nd. Thank you very much.